and welcome to the St. Augustine Art Association. This is the epicenter of the art community of St. Augustine, Florida. I'm delighted to have us joined today by two individuals, or we could call them trailblazers, who have witnessed the remarkable transformation of St. Augustine's cultural community over 9 decades. Thomas Rahner and Kay Burtin. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, pleased to have you here today. What you think the role was of some of the famous artists who came to stay and sell their works at Henry Flagler's Hotel Ponce de Leon, where they had, of course, the rich and famous, at least of the United States, there as their guests.
Henry was establishing a Riviera for the United States at the time. And of course, the art scene was Paris, Gay Paris, and so many people traveled to Europe. Oddly enough, Flagler never went. But the art scene in Paris, and especially, but in other great European cities, he thought that should be emulated in Florida. And so he gathered some of the best that he could find, and not only the guests, but Flagler himself bought some of their work and enabled them. And this put a focus on art and brought, I think, a great awareness to the local population, which they had not really had in the past.
One good artist brings 10 more who maybe aren't quite that good, but who will become that good. And so it was a growth process. And of course, Henry Flagler, being the showman that he was, realized right away that this was the way to get people to come here.
And it was a wonderful time, during the 20s with the money flowing freely, and certainly the land boom in Florida. That energy catches on with everybody, catches on with the artists as well. But as all of us know, the land boom doesn't last forever in Florida. In fact, Florida suffers the Depression before the rest of the country because the land boom really crashes in 1926, 3 years before what we usually date the beginning of the Depression. And so I love your comment about the 30s here of more talent than money.
Yes.
Although that probably is true very many places.
Everybody pulled together in the Great Depression.
This is true.
So our house became something of a salon from time to time. And we fed a lot of starving artists, even when we ourselves were down at the nub ends.
The organization began in the Jimenez Facio house right in front of the big fireplace. And it was a group of artists and writers who gathered together at the request of the editor of our St. Augustine record, Miss Nina Hawkins. And Nina herself was a miracle because she became the editor of the St. Augustine record at the age, or in the year of 1916. First woman editor in Florida. And she became the editor of the record, not because of a relative who owned it, but because of her talent. And so she was the real person who brought together what was then called the Galleon Club. And she brought these various people together. Now, she was the real originating glue, and it grew from there. The idea expanded.
I think the floodgates really opened after World War II. When the pressure of the war effort was over and people began to travel again, there was just not inundated with artists, but a large number. It had been pretty good prior to that in the 40s or late 30s, early 40s, and a number of people who were stationed in the area fell in love with St. Augustine, and they brought a great deal of talent with them because there were thousands of soldiers and sailors and their families, Coast Guard, stationed all around St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was a big R&R destination.
Well, the artists started coming in the 1920s, started coming south. But I know that the Lindenmuths were one of the original families that came, and they brought other artists from Massachusetts and other places in the north. When we were talking a few minutes ago about Todd Lindenmuth wanting to be very avant-garde, on the other hand, his wife, who painted as E.B. Warren, did pastel portraits of every important, socially important young lady in St. Augustine. And she supported them with these beautiful pictures.
And so then in the 1920s, the artists that were here wanted to establish a more formal organization for their artwork, for their art adventures, you might say, their art outings. And we have some famous names that are, associated with them. Hildegard Müller-Ury, Victor Rahner,
Yeah.
your father.
My father was a photographer and was good friends with Hildegard Müller-Ury, who was very proud of the fact that she came from the Swiss canton of Uri. She always had that displayed on the back of her car.
Yeah.
She was an indefatigable, very enthusiastic person, and Hildegard was for getting things done, as was my dad. And the artist, he was a wannabe painter. He never was really very good at it, at least in his own estimation. But he loved the milieu of working with other artists, because he was an artist in photography. And they had no place to exhibit, no place to convene. And so they were looking for, I think, camaraderie, and also so that they could display their works. So they wanted to share their works. And of course, there were those who
And it was
needed to sell, too.
good old spirit of competition.
What can you tell us about your reminiscences of these? Now, these I'm sure were all characters in addition to being artists.
Yes.
Or which were they more, artists or characters?
both.
I would say they were both. I think that every one of them, each one of them, I should say, had their own idiosyncrasies, and we had nicknames for them.
Such as?
Well, for instance, there was Celia Reed, and she was known as Dreamy Reed. And Dreamy Reed was a very tall, slender lady and always wore elegant hats. And she always moved about as if she was sort of in a dream.
Todd Lindenmuth was one of my favorites. Todd was a very nice fellow, but he always called my father Victor. He never said Victor, he always said Victor. And I thought that was just really strange. But he was always willing to help. He taught me how to frame pictures, how to make frames from scratch, how to paint them. And he was very generous in that sense, and always enthusiastic, and always wanting to expand towards modernism. And Todd got a lot of criticism for being too avant-garde. We look back on his works today and say, well, that's fairly tame, But at the time, he was pushing the envelope,
Right.
and that bothered some people who were too staid for their own good, really. But it's because of people like Todd that the quality...
We had competition.
And the quality steadily
Going up.
began to rise. And the winter, of course Todd they would come down from the north and winter here and then go back, he and his wife, E.B. Warren. But so many others would come in. Nunzio Viana, who was a little bantam rooster of a fellow. He loved to roll his R's, and he was an excellent cook, and he also knew how to fence, and he was a marvelous illustrator and painter, and just a Renaissance man. Funny as a rubber crutch, you know, and delightful, but had a temper. He would go off like that, and 5 minutes later he was perfectly fine.
You know, your talking reminds me of, although I mentioned my grandfather's name is on this list, I was only 1 year old when he died, so I really don't have any memories of him, just what I heard. But I've always found it interesting. I have most of the paintings that we know that are still in existence, have them in my home. And this is part of the story, he was mustard gas during World War I, and so he suffered from that for the rest of his life. I have one painting that he did the day that the war in Europe ended in 1945.
Really?
He dated it on the back, and it's the only painting that I have that is dated. So it must have been extremely important to him. I mean,
I'm
not
sure it
date,
was.
month, and year. It's right there. He must have taken the afternoon off to celebrate. Well, I don't want to let either of you two off the hook about talking to people that you know the best. Both of whom are we've talked about about your dad, Victor Rahner. We haven't talked much about your mother, Margarita Phillips. So I'd like you to tell us something about her and her role in the art community in St. Augustine.
Well, first of all, my mother was not a charter member, as Victor Rahner was. However, she and my father arrived in St. Augustine in 1925, and they stayed in the Kenwood Inn just down the street from the Art Association. And they lived in the Kenwood Inn for approximately 3 months while my father and another carpenter built our house down on South Marine Street. But Mother had taken art at both in Vassar when she was at Vassar College, and then later after her graduation she went to the Art Students League in New York. And so she was a fairly good artist. She was not a great artist, but she really loved to create.
So how did your father get into photography? I guess is the question.
He went to work for a photographer named Blair when he was 10 or 11 years of age. When school was out, he would go to Blair's studio and work until supper time. And he only went as far as the 6th grade, and then he became...
Really?
Yes.
Because I knew him, and that's a real surprise to learn that.
But he was a well-educated man because he learned every day of his life and at every opportunity. And when he got older, he would go to professional photography schools and courses, and he was always learning. There were artists who were pretty good business people in their own right. Anthony Teamy comes to mind, who was very successful, and he knew how to count his money. He was he was in an enviable position of having all of his work pre-sold.
Really?
Yeah, he didn't have to look for people to buy his work. He had a standing contract with Grand Central Galleries in New York, and everything he painted was packed up and shipped off to Grand Central. And there were artists who were very jealous, to say the least.
Of course. As a historian, I find it interesting that you are in your current building, which of course has grown over the years, but that you located your permanent residence, you might say, in the general area where they almost always met. I realized they were a bit north of here in the old Waterworks building for a while. But for the most part, they were down in this Avonlea Street area. Who made it happen and how it happened?
Hildegard Müller-Urey. Hildegard and her father and mother owned the Marion Motor Lodge right across the street. I'm pointing there. It faced on Marine Street, or excuse me, faced on Bay Street, which is now called Avenida Menendez. But they owned this piece of land, and they offered it to the Art Association at a ridiculous price, considering that it went for 3 streets. It was bounded by Charlotte Street, Cadiz Street, and Marine Street. And they offered it to us, and they even offered to loan us money at, I believe, 1% interest, something like that. It was unreal. And Hildegard said, now you've got to build a building, because if you don't build this building now, you can never, ever afford to build one. And how right she was. And then we've had additions that have enhanced the use of the gallery and its ability to be used.
And that ended the pillar to post era. Where I remember galleries, exhibits in the houses along Charlotte Street and wherever you could find an empty building that could be rented for a pittance. And then after Hildegard and all of those hardworking people, you got people like Evelyn Vale Kettner, who was not an artist.
No.
But she was a bulldog when it
Evelyn was a mover and a shaker of the first order.
And that kind of spirit, that kind of drive, that kind of persistence is what is why we have such a wonderful facility today.
These people that you're talking about and the genesis of this building, which of course has grown over the decades. How important do you think it was to have a permanent location for the Art Association itself? What did that mean to the artists?
Very important.
Yeah, well, it spoke of stability and an anchor, a home for the artist's focus. Yes, it was very important.
And of course, the main thing was they then had a place where they could exhibit their artwork. Heretofore, they would just put an exhibit up wherever they could rent a room for 75 cents. And it might be up for 2 or 3 days, but then it would just disappear. But now we had a place where they could have regular shows, and furthermore, they could have sketch groups. And it was just a real cultural center, even though there was always squabbling about
everything.
Yes. We were severely limited in what we could put up, what we could store, and there just was never any space for anything. And then a few years after we built the wings, which really expanded what we could do, it gave us a whole new ability to exhibit and to have entertainments and things. Then the gardens. So the beautiful garden that we have now in front, and that was the icing on the cake. We now look professional.
I'd like to move the conversation in a little bit different direction right now, because I think the Art Association has, in more recent times, and representing so many things that go on in our society, have really reached out to bring art to people that aren't artists. Not just the paintings hanging on the wall, but school programs, camps, and things such as that. You know, a real not aggressive but assertive approach to bring art. So can you talk some about that?
For years, I had tried to involve the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind in our programs, and I never could get in. And somehow Elise was able to do it. And this was the result, this touchable signage. And it's just a wonderful thing. People are very, very impressed. And Europeans who come here are impressed by the fact that we have this facility. It's amazing. But yes, we have for years had summer art camp. In the beginning, it was just 1 or 2 weeks, and it was just a very small effort. But it has grown and grown. And of course, the thing about summer art camp, the children learn so much more than just how to do something. But they learn to think, and they learn to look. And of course, being an artist, the main part of art is perceiving with your eyes and being able to transfer that information to the viewer. And these children are learning this. So it's a wonderful program.
Oh, I think it's just so inspirational.
And we've had exhibits from the all of the St. Johns County high schools first, and then we went to all of the St. Johns County middle schools to bring in the best artworks from all of the schools all around the county. And that's not only delightful, but it's scary because these kids are so talented and so creative. And we realize that this is the next crop of members of the Art Association and creators.
That's right. And while you've been doing that, you've also been establishing some permanent collections. Is that not correct? What can you tell me about the permanent collections and what's their themes or who is featured in them?
Well, Tom Rahner, for one thing, has donated his father's negatives and prints, some of them, and we treasure those. Other major contributions, the Chastain collection, and my sister Faith Tiberio has just left, in her will, she left a series of paintings of St. Augustine. It really started, the permanent collection started when I became the administrator in 1989. There were about 5 or 6 paintings in the closet. And I said, well, whose paintings are these and why are they here? And the only answer I ever got was, well, just hold on to them. So that was the nucleus of the permanent collection. And we added to it from then on.
At this point, what do you think the future holds for the St. Augustine Art Association and its place in our city or even the larger society? What do you see for the next 10 years, maybe?
Oh, well, I'm not a seer or don't have a crystal ball, but I think the awareness of art in all aspects, not just painting and drawing and sculpture, music, dance, writing, all of these have begun to blossom even more in this area.
We have a wonderful future ahead, and as a matter of fact, every exhibit that we have, and we change our exhibits every month, and I walk around and I say, I just don't know where this is all going to end, because each one is better than the one before it. And you just wonder, there's so much talent here.
What a great time to point out that, yes, the Art Association is here and has all these wonderful things, but we're also part of a much larger movement in St. Augustine and in Northeast Florida.
This is very true, and I'm particularly pleased that the Art Association has revived the idea of plein air painting, because this is where we started. And we're back to plein air painting, but it's newly revitalized. And it's just wonderful to see the artists go out and see what they can create in an hour or two, and then bring it back, put it in the wet room, and the tourists go around and they look and they buy.
Well, the tourists like to watch them while they're doing it.
It would be impossible to give the credit that's due to Faith and Joseph Tiberio for their outstanding generosity to the St. Augustine Art Association and to the
Thank you.
community as a whole.
Right.
They were benefactors to the arts at large, and they are of sainted memory. But that 95-year thread has been maintained lovingly by artists and other interested
Absolutely.
citizens. And it's provided that continuity that's enabled this growth to take place. It's very tenuous at times, very tenuous, but persistence pays, and sticking with it and doing what the artists love to do. Creativity is at the heart of it all, and that creative muse has been kept alive in large measure by what the Art Association has done over the years for almost a century.